Hey everyone, welcome back. This is my second video. We're going to talk a little bit about Indigenous Australians. Before I start, I'd like to clarify a few things. Indigenous Australians is a collective term for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. To say the Aboriginals is not actually correct because they consider themselves entirely separate societies of people, and for good reason. This is not just a geographic concern, but it's also cultural. It would be like calling Austrians Germans or calling Belgians French. So it's not only offensive, it's just technically incorrect as well. The term First Australians or First Nations peoples is also becoming increasingly popular. And lastly, the word Aborigines is no longer used. It's considered a fairly offensive colonialist term that we just try and avoid now. I'm bound to make some mistakes with the terminology, so I apologize in advance for that. It's also worth mentioning that there will be photos of deceased and living Indigenous people throughout the video. Also, just an FYI, a huge amount of the information for this video is coming from the book The Politics of Human Rights in Australia by Lisa Hill, Louise Chappell, and John Chesterman. It's a fantastic book, not just for this, but for other sections as well. There's also a whole section on refugees, the age of terror, and gender and sexuality rights that I haven't even got to yet. So it's a really good book. I recommend you check it out. I'm going to be using this so much in the video, I might occasionally just refer to it as the book. I acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture, and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to note that I currently reside on land belonging to the Wurundjeri Willam people of the Woiwurrung language group, which is part of the Kulin Alliance. If you're interested in a map of the Indigenous language groups, there's a link available in the description where you can buy or just look at the map. Part 1. The Stolen Generations, Ongoing Suffering of Indigenous Peoples, and Liberty. The Indigenous peoples of Australia are one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. The numbers vary, but the experts all agree on somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 years old. They are also by many metrics one of the most oppressed peoples on Earth, and also one of the extreme minorities, with a population of under 800,000 Indigenous Australians remaining in 2016, and that's including the fact that the population grew by 19% between 2011 and 2016. First Australians are vastly overrepresented in rates of suicide, depression, incarceration, drug abuse, and have very low health outcomes and education outcomes. Between approximately 1910 and 1970, Australia's Indigenous peoples were victims of a genocide known as the Stolen Generations, in which between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 children were forcibly removed from black families and given to the care of white families. This was done to assimilate into the white population, or otherwise not kill, but let die the Indigenous peoples and their culture. Many of the children were killed, abused, or otherwise traumatized for life. They were educated very poorly, if at all, and were kept alive basically only as slaves. Some of these children and their parents are still alive and looking for their families because so few records were kept. Many of the parents likewise were killed trying to stop their children being taken away, and those that weren't, a large amount turned to alcohol and other drugs in order to cope with the trauma. Article 2 of the UN Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide clearly states that this is genocide. Of course, our government disagrees with that categorization, that very clear definition of genocide. But the oppression of First Nations peoples is not confined to the past. Here are some other ways in which Australia has either failed to protect or intentionally oppressed Indigenous peoples. The Australian government has on multiple occasions suspended its own Racial Discrimination Act, such as in the Northern Territory interventions in 2007, which were made to protect the welfare of Indigenous children. In the interventions, they limited access to the internet, alcohol, and they even quarantined welfare payments, which significantly restricted the freedom of Indigenous Australians. The government can suspend acts like this at will. It doesn't just relate to Indigenous Australians, they can actually do it to anyone, as long as they make it clear within the policy or within the legislation that they deliberately intend to infringe on those rights. This makes it very difficult for courts to defend rights abuses by the Australian government, especially when the Australian government thinks that by abridging those rights, it's doing the correct thing. This is exactly what happened with the mandatory detention on Manus Island. The High Court ruled that mandatory detention is valid and legal, because Parliament intended to abridge the rights of asylum seekers. For those of you that don't know, the mandatory detention on Manus Island limited freedom of speech, access to counsel, rights relating to the collection of evidence, and even habeas corpus. So there was no legal recourse. Representation is also an issue for Indigenous Australians. Even though there are more First Nations people in Parliament than ever before, they're still very underrepresented, especially at the really high levels of government. In tandem with this fact, census data shows that between 25 and 32% of the population of the Northern Territory is Indigenous. The reason this matters is that they are a territory, not a state, which means any laws they pass regarding their own citizens can be federally overwritten without purpose. Territories are effectively run by the federal government instead of a state government. On top of that, they only have 2 senators, whereas states have 12 senators, which is nothing like equal representation. While the population of the Northern Territory is very low, about twice that of the town I grew up in, that's really not the point. For the record, the Northern Territory has tried to become a state multiple times, but has ultimately failed. It's never tried to actually accommodate the desires of the Indigenous population, so if it were ever to actually achieve statehood, it would need to be in collaboration with its Indigenous peoples. All of these examples are substantial, but the ongoing lack of opportunity and disadvantage faced by Indigenous people is indicative of a rights culture that is very focused on what the philosopher Isaiah Berlin called negative liberty. Negative liberty refers to the absence of obstacles. So laws that focus on negative liberty are there to stop other people from infringing on your rights, such as racial discrimination acts, while making sure First Nations people are not actively discriminated against and are treated the same as white people in a formal capacity is very important work. That's not necessarily the only problem that Indigenous people face. Indigenous communities not being within range of a hospital is a classic example of something that negative liberty does not address. As it says in the book, this remains a contentious issue to this day. One way to articulate it is to ask, what level of disparity in access to services can be permitted before one person's rights might be said to be being breached? Positive liberty, on the other hand, is arguably more relevant in the 21st century for combating Indigenous concerns. It includes things like access to welfare, education, and other things that you might consider social rights. Positive liberty also encompasses 3 things that minority groups the world over always struggle with: social acceptance, the ability to participate in politics, and freedom from internal alienation. Positive liberty is basically everything that allows you to self-determine what it is you wish to be, and is key to ensuring the direction of Indigenous communities. The Australian government, however, has infringed on the positive liberty of First Nations peoples, notably with programs known as RPAs and SRAs. These are types of agreements in which the government provides services or funds only if certain objectives are met within the community. They're performance initiatives. One of these was signed in 2005 for the Mulan community of Western Australia, in which the Australian government agreed to provide $216,588 to cover the installation of petrol bowsers within the community, on the proviso, among other things, that members of the Mulan community would start and keep up a program to make sure kids shower every day and wash their face twice a day. This is not only demeaning, but precisely the kind of thing that diminishes positive liberty. Controlling people's actions in return for their access to services directly contradicts the idea of self-determination. There were multiple warning signs at the time, and even now, that this could essentially be regarded as government-sanctioned blackmail. Both the inherited and present pain of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders is tragic, and they are continually underrepresented or entirely absent from decisions that impact their communities directly. While some efforts to assist communities may be positive, often what is done results in a diminished capacity of First Nations people to bring about a future which is theirs to determine. Part 2. Rights Declarations, Democracy and International Treaties. For those that don't know, Australia does not have a Declaration of Human Rights. Instead, we have a system of implied rights. Basically, what this means is that legislators play a much larger role in determining rights and protecting them through legislation than they do in countries like the US with an explicit Declaration of Human Rights. The framers of the Australian Constitution feared that a Bill of National Rights would limit state government authority. A particularly pertinent example is that they were afraid that immigrants and minorities could evoke a national equality clause in order to be able to become minors in states where previously they were not allowed to. They feared that this would allow immigrants, aliens, and First Nations people to have too much power in the economy of Australia. As it says in the book, evidence from the debates indicates that the rights about which state governments were most jealous were those relating to their freedoms to discriminate on racial grounds. Not having a declaration of rights is not necessarily a good or bad thing. There are arguments for and against from both sides of politics that are regularly made. I think it's more important and interesting to ask why we don't have such a document. For British jurist, historian, and politician James Bryce, the absence of an American-style Bill of Rights reflected considerable differences between the US and English perception of where rights threats lay. The US Bill of Rights was designed to protect citizens from a potentially abusive legislature, whereas in the English tradition it was a crown and not the legislature that was held in suspicion. Parliament was for so long a time the protector of Englishmen against the arbitrary executive that they did not form the habit of taking precautions against abuse from the powers of the legislature, and their struggles for a fuller freedom took the form of making Parliament a more truly popular and representative body, not that of restricting its authority. This is important to remember because when the Australian Constitution was drafted, we were British by any other name, and that legacy definitely had an effect on how we crafted our government. Criticisms of entrenched rights bills include that they make it much harder to flexibly respond to situations as they occur, because there are certain things you just can't do infringing on the rights of certain people. For example, unfairly imprison refugees. Entrenched rights bills also can be seen as patronising the people that they apply to. Lawyer Harrison Moore said that the US Bill of Rights reflected a spirit of distrust in the ability of the people to elect officials and decide upon their own laws. Australia's ambassador in Washington, Owen Dixon, reiterated this, saying instead, "These US constitutional checks on legislative action were undemocratic, because to adopt them argued a want of confidence in the will of the people." On the other hand, you could say that the implication of the Australian Constitution when it comes to race is that prejudice doesn't even exist, and thus needs no recognition, because people are always nice. The general concept of rights in a democracy is that they are determined and protected by voting citizens who belong to a group or groups that hold similar beliefs, and for most people that works fairly well. But that doesn't mean that everyone agrees that democracy is all that is required to protect rights. Many believe, including the authors of the book, that representative democracy is not enough to protect the rights of minorities within it. They need even more protection. The tyranny of the majority is a fairly popular idea. I think it was actually coined by the US founding fathers, but the idea has been around as long as democracy has. Basically, it states that if we accept that democracy is the idea of majority rule, we must also acknowledge the fact that majority rule can replace a traditional tyrant with multiple tyrannical individuals. These individuals can make the same tyrannical decisions as a tyrant, but they have the advantage of being perceived as just. Its might makes right. Because Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders are such a minority, they're particularly at risk of being affected by tyranny of the majority, even if the effects are unintentional. It is notable that bills of rights have been used specifically to counter the idea of tyranny of the majority by ensuring rights. While a Bill of Rights will go some way to ensuring the rights of Indigenous Australians, it wouldn't necessarily make the right to vote any more sacred. And as it says in the book, being able to vote is effectively the right to have rights. First Nations people have been continually prevented from voting, explicitly or not. And even if they did vote, there's such an apathetic and small base of voters that they're rarely catered to in elections and have no real representative power even if they do all vote. Indigenous Australians didn't have the right to vote until 1983, not 1967. That's a misconception that's pretty common. The decision in 1967 gave states the authority but not the obligation to count Aboriginal people in census data. That's it. However, if you were an Indigenous voter in 1902 and you were still on the electoral roll in 1967, then you were allowed to vote. Imagine how many people were still alive from then. If you were in the military, you were allowed to vote from 1949 onwards. In 1983, voting and enrolment was made compulsory for Indigenous Australians, just as it was for white Australians for the years before. But facilities to allow voting, both then and now, are much harder to access for people in rural communities, which is where the majority of First Nations people live. Prisoners also don't have the right to vote in Australia in certain states, depending if they've been imprisoned multiple times or for an extended period of time. That wouldn't be a race issue if Indigenous people weren't more likely to be convicted in the first place and for longer periods of time than white Australians. The numbers change from time to time, but last time I checked, they were 9 times overrepresented in prison populations. Even after leaving jail, re-enrollment after being struck from the electoral roll is a very difficult process, and it's made even harder by living in rural communities. Sometimes this renders a temporary punishment a permanent rights issue. But wait, you might be thinking, surely these rights are part of international law and covered by many UN treaties to which Australia is a signatory, and you would be right. But Australia has a dualist legal system. What that means is that the executive branch of government, i.e., the Prime Minister and the party in power, can sign a treaty, but the legislative branch of Parliament is under no such obligation to enter that treaty into the law. This leads to further confusion about whether these implied rights are intended to be upheld or not. It's like saying that we agree with the principle of these treaties, but they're not part of our law structure. The few times that courts have ruled in favour of those rights in those treaties, which aren't part of our common law, they have been criticised as lawmaking instead of adjudicating. Australia has a strained relationship with the UN. We've become something of a favourite punching bag for them, and for pretty good reason. While Australia obeys its own laws, it has a concern over its sovereignty and as such is resistant to obey international treaties that might threaten that. In particular, Parliament refuses to pass any legislation that places international law above the national law. Australia is now the only country within the common law world without a strict system for the protection of rights. Australia also regularly refuses to consider recommendations from within and without, but especially from bodies like the UN. This attitude is the same as the Australian Constitution framers held towards the US Constitution, at the same time insulted by the idea that Parliament needs oversight, yet still responsible for violating rights that it itself has entered into consideration. A final note on the UN, and this should tell you all you really need to know about the situation. Australia, the USA, Canada, and New Zealand all voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. The vote was 143 in favour to 4 against. Good job, guys. For Australia's part, this was because the Liberal Howard government, which we'll talk more about later, felt that the declaration would provide a particular group with the rights to veto decisions of a democratically elected parliament. Secondly, it would provide rights over land that could override legitimate interests in land held by others, and open up the question of compensation. Man, I'd hate to open up the question of compensation too if I were in their position. 2 years later, the Labor government changed the vote to adopt the declaration. The fact that Australia has no Declaration of Rights has hurt many already marginalised groups, including LGBT people, immigrants, aliens, women, but none more so than its own First Nations people. Representative democracy was supposed to overcome this flaw by giving every person, insofar as is practicable, an equal say and an equal vote in their rights. But as we've seen, oftentimes this has either been denied or just ineffectual. International bodies like the UN have a very tense and strained relationship with the Australian government, and they have very little ability to enact real change because of what Australia perceives as a threat to the democratic will of its citizens. In hindsight, it is also apparent that the constitutional framers had misplaced confidence in the populace being sufficiently concerned about these issues to remove governments from office over rights issues. Part 3. Land Rights, Native Title, and Recognition. At the heart of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concerns lies an issue that ties in deeply with their culture, spirituality, their ability to self-determine, and their identity. Who owns Australia, and who has rights to the lands within it? In 1976, the government passed the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory, which allows Indigenous people to place a claim on land if they can provide evidence of traditional association. In the ensuing years, almost 50% of all land in the Northern Territory was collectively claimed by First Australians. Other states also passed laws to do the same. Later in 1993, the government passed the Native Title Act, which was made in response to the Mabo ruling. It's a really big landmark case that honestly deserves a video all on its own, but I don't have time to go into it now. The result of the Mabo case was basically that the High Court ruled that Australia was not terra nullius, or nobody's land, when the British arrived, and this meant that Indigenous people had a claim to the lands. Mabo was one of those cases that I mentioned earlier where the courts were criticised for creating law rather than adjudicating it. Native title recognises that First Nations peoples had a claim to Australia and the lands within it before colonisation. It grants them access to those lands and waters for cultural reasons, and most importantly, it allows them to protect their lands and sacred sites. There are plenty more land acts around, but these are really the main overarching ones. And native title is all well and good, but again, the Australian government has suspended its own acts multiple times, as well as baking in certain concessions, such as the fact that a mining lease can coexist with a native title claim. So much for protecting the land. I just wish I had better news about how this ends. The Hindmarsh Island Bridge Act of 1997 actively prevented the protection of significant Aboriginal sites within the construction area, just by saying, we recognise that native title exists, but it doesn't really apply in this case, and they gave no reasons for it. The High Court ruled the Act itself a legitimate exercise of parliamentary power, but they never really considered whether an act like this that disadvantages racial groups was constitutional. This amounts to suspension of the Native Title Act, a specific Heritage Protection Act passed in 1984, and complete ignorance of the fact that the Racial Discrimination Act even exists. I know I've talked a bit about implied rights and legally sort of sticky examples, so let's look at some more tangible and blatant examples now. The Kimberley Land Council was established in 1978 to protect the land of the Kimberley region in Western Australia and to advocate for Indigenous concerns. On their website, there are currently 2 rolling titles, and they read as follows. 1. High Court decision disempowers traditional owners. 2. Destruction of sacred sites in the East Kimberley. In the first article, the High Court denied exclusive access rights to native title land on the Dampier Peninsula, where there were no other competing claims. Tyrone Garston, the acting CEO of the KLC, sums it up pretty succinctly. This ruling undermines the basis of what native title, and particularly what exclusive native title, was designed to do. This case only applies to unallocated Crown land. That means land on which the only known interest is native title. So let's be clear, no right of access exists here other than that of the native title holders who are the only ones with any legal rights to this area. This ruling makes the situation even more unclear. How does public access and exclusive native title coexist? In the second article, a mining company called Kimberley Granite Holdings illegally dug up a sacred burial site without permission, lied about ceasing its operations, and declined to stop works on the site in order to enter into a heritage protection agreement to prevent further damage, as if that was somehow a request. Rusty Peters is one of the Indigenous custodians of the land, who are responsible for keeping the area safe. When I first heard about the mining, I was shocked. I didn't know about it. I didn't give the company permission. I didn't give anyone authority to make this decision for me. This makes me very worried. I'm not going to stop worrying. White people cutting our culture up. They ripped my country open. Kimberley Granite Holdings has since applied for a mining lease for the area, which they're likely to get even without permission from the traditional owners. A decision isn't expected before November 2020. When asked about this, former CEO of the KLC, Nolan Hunter, said, "This is the fundamental flaw that is enabling the continued destruction of Aboriginal sacred sites. The combination of weak legislation, inefficient government policy, and the industry knowing state and federal laws won't stop them doing what they want is putting enormous pressure on traditional owners. Perhaps the largest and most egregious example of this is the Carmichael coal mine application. It's put forward by Adani, an Indian mining conglomerate. In 2010, Adani proposed to build a mine, rail, and port to export cheap and inefficient brown coal. But notice really picked up in 2014 when the Environment Minister, Greg Hunt, approved it. The Environment Minister. It's not just Indigenous activists who are against the mine, it's also environmental activists and basically anyone you talk to except the government. The Carmichael mine will further threaten multiple species of endangered animals and will almost certainly result in the extinction of the black-throated finch. Waterways, wetlands, and forests are also at stake, all of which contain sites of Indigenous significance. Adani will also be dredging directly through the Great Barrier Reef and will be massively increasing shipping through ocean heritage areas. The thing is, Adani had to seek permission from the traditional owners of this land in order to go ahead with it, and when they asked them, predictably they said no. Adani then went to the government and asked them to extinguish the Native Title Act on the land that they wanted, which unbelievably just worked, so it's going ahead. Adani has actually been accused of paying Indigenous people to stack the mine deal votes in their favour. An official tally of the votes registered 294 in favour to 1 against, which is a ridiculous number, especially seeing as there's a family of 8 people who all voted against and came out and said that. If you're interested, I've put some links to some of the Stop Adani petitions below in the description. Some of these breaches of rights are legal and formal, and some are a lot more practical and substantive. Either way, the Australian government has chosen to ignore breaches of law, suspend rights specifically designed to conserve Indigenous land, or in the case of Adani, simply legislate away existing acts when it suits them. As an aside, Australia is a unique country in an environmental aspect. Land management is not something that Europeans were used to having to do to the same extent that Aboriginal people were doing when the Europeans first arrived. Part of the reason bushfires are so dangerous in Australia is that land management here is so labour intensive and counterintuitive. Certain areas have been managed incorrectly for so long that the environment barely has time to recover before the next major fire sweeps through. In his book Dark Emu, Bruce Pascoe writes about how Indigenous peoples employ fire in order to bring game to an area, manage the land, and even grow crops. This also prevents bushfires to the extent that we've seen the last few years, where the government has been placing less and less importance on the practice of controlled burning. While Aboriginal people used fire as a tool for increasing the productivity of their environment, Europeans saw fire as a threat. Without regular, low-intensity burning, leaf litter accumulates and crown fires can result, destroying everything in their path. European settlers feared fire, for it could destroy their houses, their crops, and it could destroy them. Yet the environment which was so attractive to them was created by fire. We still don't know the extent of First Nations land management within Australia, but if so many Indigenous populations had not been displaced from their land, Australia would be physically a much different place today. We are gravely concerned about the push by Adani and the Queensland and federal governments to open up the Carmichael mine on our traditional lands. Our traditional lands are an interconnected and living whole, a vital cultural landscape. If the Carmichael mine were to proceed, it would tear the heart out of the land. The scale of this mine means it would have devastating impacts on our native title. It would literally leave a huge black hole, monumental in proportions, where there were once our homelands. These effects are irreversible. Our land will be disappeared. Part 4. Recognition and important dates. As you can tell from these policies, or the outcome of them, recognition of Indigenous peoples, whether in a legal or a cultural sense, is still an issue in Australia. A big part of this is that many of the advocates for Indigenous people are Indigenous themselves, and in case you haven't noticed, there's not that many of them around, and those with the time, the desire, the resources, and the power to effect real change are even fewer. In terms of social recognition, the government doesn't seem very keen to push that very much, and frankly, the media coverage is almost entirely negative. You hear when things go wrong, but you don't hear about exciting cultural opportunities within Indigenous culture. And that's a shame because social engagement is such an issue, and there's so many opportunities to celebrate Indigenous culture that I'd never even heard of before. These are a few significant dates listed on the Queensland Government's website, many of which are national or shared by my home state of Victoria. Mabo Day is one that occasionally gets a mention, at least, but it should really be more significant. Mabo is the Martin Luther King of Indigenous land rights. There's a short statement about it given by Daniel Andrews, the Labor Premier of Victoria, which I'll link below. The most demoralising thing about this list is that most of these dates are just anniversaries. They brand themselves as an opportunity to talk about Indigenous peoples, but what we really need is for people to be engaged enough with First Nations people that talking about them becomes part of our national narrative. I was aware of some of these dates before making this video, but I've never really seen enough being done on Reconciliation Week or NAIDOC Week. Maybe I'm out of the loop, but regardless, the perception there is pretty concerning, I think. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have cultures that are rich and deserving of recognition, but moreover, they are deserving of legal respect and enforcement by a body that actively advocates for the rights of the people belonging to those cultures. This includes protection for their rights to the lands we now occupy and immunity from parliamentary discretion to overturn or suspend those rights. Part 5. The Left and the Right, and how they have interacted with Indigenous Australians. Before I continue, just some quick clarification for our neighbours. When we say Liberal here, we mean the right or Conservative Party, who are called the Liberal Party. When we say Labor, we mean the Left or Progressive Party. As much as I disagree with the whole left-right dichotomy, that's the easiest way to explain it for the moment. I will try not to appear too left or right-wing and try and stay impartial, but you're going to see that that's not going to be particularly easy in this case. This video is quickly becoming very long, so I'm just going to do some basic outlines from the two major parties from the recent governments. First, the left. The 1972 to 1975 Whitlam government. Labor leader Gough Whitlam said at the beginning of the 1972 campaign, "We will legislate to give Aboriginals land rights, because all of us as Australians are diminished while the Aborigines are denied their rightful place in this nation." The Whitlam government then set up the Woodward Commission, which existed from 1973 to 1974, which resulted in two reports from which the Land Rights Act was drafted. It was then proposed in 1975 and passed in 1976 with bipartisan support, despite the Prime Minister actually being removed due to a constitutional crisis. The 1983 to 1991 Hawke government. Bob Hawke was the first politician to promise an Indigenous treaty that would solidify rights for Indigenous people in the Constitution, but he suffered significant pushback for it and it's still not in place till this day. Hawke actually died recently in 2019, but he was remembered very fondly by Indigenous leaders. I've linked an article about it below. The 1991 to 1996 Keating government. Paul Keating's government enshrined the 1993 Native Title Act. He also created the post of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. This person basically keeps an eye on the Native Title Act and makes sure that it's being used properly to promote the enjoyment of rights to land for Indigenous peoples. Paul Keating also gave the famous Redfern speech, considered to be one of the greatest in Australian history. More on that one later. The 2007 to 2013 Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. As Parliament's first order of business on February the 13th, 2008, Kevin Rudd gave a formal and televised apology to the stolen generations in which, spoilers, the next Liberal Prime Minister of our fine country, Mr. Abbott, seems to be the only person not to clap. There's a link available below to that one. Rudd also announced the reformation of an Indigenous peak representative body, which he wouldn't have had to do if the former Liberal Howard government had not abolished it. Rudd, along with the opposition leader Brandon Nelson, also signed the Close the Gap Statement of Intent. The Close the Gap program is intended to address the disparity in health, education, and employment outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Rudd was then removed from office due to a leadership spill by Julia Gillard. She tried to push for a referendum to include and recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. Ultimately, that failed because an election was coming up, and both her and the Indigenous leaders realised that a hasty referendum would do more to harm relations than to mend them. Incidentally, Gillard was then removed from office by Rudd in another leadership spill. He was in office for another 3 months before the next election was called. Labor has always been the more progressive side of politics here in Australia, and doubtless has been a much better friend to First Australians than the Liberals have. But politics is very slow, and in order to do anything, you have to be in power. And as I've said, such a small and apathetic group of voters, such as First Nations people, is very, very hard to legislate for. Kevin Rudd noted in his apology to the Stolen Generations, "We today take this first step by acknowledging the past and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians. A future where this Parliament resolves that the injustices of the past must never, never happen again." Remember that comment. On to the right. The 1975 to 1983 Fraser government. Malcolm Fraser was a rare individual. He had a keen interest in multiculturalism and foreign policy, advocating both for migrant and Indigenous concerns. His cause for reconciliation gained widespread bipartisan support. Fraser also helped legislate the 1976 Land Rights Act, the one that Gough Whitlam had been unable to pass due to the constitutional crisis earlier. The 1996 to 2007 Howard government. John Howard is a special case. To this day, he refuses to apologise to the Indigenous peoples for the stolen generations. He refuses to believe that genocide ever occurred, and he was the only living former Prime Minister not to be present when Kevin Rudd made his apology. John Howard also continually opposed the treaty process and was the main reason Australia voted no on the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Under him, the government dissolved AIATSIS, the peak representative body that Kevin Rudd had to reform. That suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act in 2007 in the Northern Territory, that was the Howard government. The RPAs and SRAs that were described as government-sanctioned blackmail, that also was the Howard government. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home report was delivered to Howard, having been 2 years in the making. It was a report on the removal of children from Indigenous families for the stolen generations, and it recommended that a full apology be made, which Howard refused to do. Realistically speaking, the worst violations of First Nations people's rights in the last 30 years in Australia have been a direct result of the Howard government. It's worth noting here that during Rudd's speech for the stolen generations, there was opposition from some of the Liberals. The overriding Liberal concern with the speech was that it would open up the subject for legal claims, as if that somehow isn't fair if it does. Anyway, that's a view that's shared by Howard as well. The 2013 to current Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government. Tony Abbott is a mixed bag in terms of Indigenous people. He spent time teaching in Indigenous communities, he campaigned for constitutional recognition, and he even said that the Howard government not offering an apology for the stolen generations was a mistake. But Abbott has also denied that First Nations people face any discrimination within the legal system, and has even said as recently as June that Australians have our own atoning to do. Our history, nevertheless, has been different and I would say better than that of the US. Even if that were true, and I don't necessarily think that it is, I am constantly frustrated at how the US is held up as a convenient yardstick for underachieving nations in terms of human rights. Tony Abbott feels like the kind of person that says they can't be racist because they have loads of black friends. Having been around for his entire prime ministership, it's hard not to imagine that everything he did was for political gain. Abbott was defeated in a leadership spill by Malcolm Turnbull in 2015. Turnbull was a notably more moderate Prime Minister, but I don't think he was any more benevolent. In response to the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart, which I've linked below, Turnbull repeatedly refused calls for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. This was basically a way for First Nations people to have their voices heard and to be enshrined in the Constitution, with the hopes of it leading to a treaty eventually. I remember hearing an Indigenous woman talk about this on the radio, actually, An important thing that politicians didn't seem to grasp about this proposal is that it wasn't an authority that Indigenous people wanted to define themselves. First Nations people were offering the government full control over what form that voice took, even if it had no real power, and Turnbull still turned it down. Turnbull was then defeated in another leadership spill in 2018 by Scott Morrison, the current Prime Minister. Morrison is ignorant, but doesn't seem actively harmful, at least in terms of policy. He did once say that slavery never existed in Australia. This is one of those myths that's so obviously incorrect that you think that no one's ever actually believed it, let alone the Prime Minister of Australia. There absolutely was slavery in Australia. I was under the impression that this photo of Indigenous slaves was more famous, but maybe I'm wrong. Morrison also released a new agreement on closing the gap, which drew some negative criticism from Indigenous leaders, basically because it seems to say that Indigenous people haven't been trying hard enough. But it also notes that more consultation will be had with Indigenous people going ahead to actually look at the outcomes. I don't know, we'll see what actually comes of that. It's only come into effect as of August this year. We're almost done with the Liberals, but first, I want to talk briefly about Alan Jones. He's a now retired right-wing commentator and political aspirant. He's very supportive of the Liberal Party and at one point was up for pre-selection for a position within the party. I think it's fair to say that his voice carries weight and his opinions reflect some trends within the Liberal Party itself. A few years ago, Alan Jones advocated for another stolen generation to get mistreated children out of environments of abuse, and insinuating at the same time that the stolen generation was originally done to help children. That's obviously not okay, but he's not alone in this. Senator Pauline Hanson also said this. I can't find the actual clip of it, unfortunately, so I can't link it below, but I know it happened. It's just really important. I need to bring it up. Hanson was originally a Liberal, but she was disendorsed by the Liberal Party after she made some racist comments about Indigenous people, something about them being racist because they received more welfare than non-Indigenous people and how that in itself was racist. You name it and she said it, basically. Hanson then started her own political party under the name One Nation. Just for kicks, here are the associated ideological tags on Wikipedia. One Nation still regularly sides with the Liberals in Parliament. If you want to know more about Hanson and One Nation, there's loads to read out there, including a video of her telling two very ruffled-looking Indigenous women that she was Indigenous too because she was born here. There have been other calls for another stolen generation in Australia as well. Off the top of my head, there's a morning show called Sunrise that's the target of an ongoing lawsuit for just that reason. Anyway, that's the left and the right. I hope that's helped some people understand not just the positions surrounding First Nations people within Australia, but also to the extent that openly racist views and ignorance of Indigenous culture are tolerated within the media and at the highest levels of government. Part 6. The Future. I grew up in a very white neighbourhood, and my experiences will not be the same as everyone else's within Australia, but I was 13 years old before I saw a black person, and I was 20 years old before I saw an Indigenous Australian. I also went through 13 years of public schooling, and I never learned anything at all about Indigenous Australian culture. I learned every year about the same 4 topics in history. Only 90s kids will remember this. I learned about the Eureka Stockade, the Gold Rush, Ned Kelly and his gang, and Captain Cook and the First Fleet, and that was it. Australia does not have a Black History Month. The closest thing we have is Reconciliation Week, but frankly, it's always felt like a bit of a token effort. There's a short article about it that I'll link below as well. As I post this video, it's Black History Month in the UK. That's crazy to me. The nation that colonised what is now the English-speaking world oppressed people of colour all around it and has no Indigenous black people to speak of, that I'm aware of at least, has Black History Month, and Australia does not. Somehow I feel that if we did have a Black History Month, there would be less need for me to have made this video. I'm not a rights lawyer, but if you ask me, it seems ill-fitting that Australia does not have a Charter of Rights. A fair go is basically our national slogan. Yet when it comes to removing racial exclusion from our constitution, as we did in the 1967 referendum, the most successful referendum in Australian history, It takes years to bring policy in line with what by any measure is clear public sentiment. That is a lose-lose system for Indigenous Australians, who either fall through the gaps or take years of litigation and demonstration to get the results that they deserve. Any way you spin it, that is racism. What was stolen from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders cannot be wholly given back, but it can be recognised as a mistake that cuts to the very heart of Australia's colonial past and be apologised for. We can work on that together. Indeed, we must work on that together. Putting laws into place to let First Nations people register claims on land, putting them in control of what happens to those lands, allowing them to protect them and access them is, in a word, just. But overturning such legislation at the explicit denial of said peoples is tyranny. Any way you spin it, that is racism. Australians, if you're watching, you can help. If you're a parent and you know nothing about Indigenous culture, it's likely that your child doesn't know anything either. Educate yourself and share that knowledge with them. Who knows where curiosity could take them in the future? Australians who travel, you should travel Australia. It's exciting, and you're constantly complaining to me about the price of European vacations. I have it on good authority that there's a really big rock in the middle somewhere. While you're out there, you can help Indigenous communities by donating, spending money within their economies, or just learning about the people. If you don't like to travel, you can go to your local First Nations art, cultural centre, museum, they're everywhere. And be on the lookout for Indigenous cultural events in your area. Most museums are also now online, and they're usually free. I realise we're all stuck at home right now, so here are 4 things I recommend you do. Links are all below. If you like social commentary, watch this video on racism and disadvantage by the Indigenous rap artist Briggs. It's a short video, but importantly, he has a lived experience of racism that I can't give you. If you like music, listen to some music by the Indigenous artist Gurrumul. He has a unique style that is a blend of traditional Aboriginal music and everything from drums and bass to orchestral accompaniment. If you like to read, then It's Raining in Mango by Thea Astley is a fantastic book. It's a unique fictional autobiography comprising stories from a single Indigenous family that spans a century. If you like visual art, look up some of the fantastic work by Albert Namatjira, one of Australia's national art icons, who also happens to be Indigenous and has a fantastic original style. Anyway, I think that's about enough from me. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time. So like, comment, subscribe, etc., and hope to see you again. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to be here today at the launch of Australia's celebration of the 1993 International Year of the World's Indigenous People. It will be a year of great significance for Australia. It comes at a time when we have committed ourselves to succeeding in the test which so far we have always failed. Because, in truth, we cannot confidently say that we have succeeded as we would like to have succeeded if we had not managed to extend opportunity and care, dignity and hope to the Indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. This is a fundamental test of our social goals and our national will. Our ability to say to ourselves and the rest of the world that Australia is a first-rate social democracy, that we are what we should be, truly the land of the fair go and the better chance. There is no more basic test of how seriously we mean these things. It is a test of our self-knowledge. More, I think, than most Australians recognise, the plight of Aboriginal Australians affects us all. In Redfern, it might be tempting to think that the reality Aboriginal Australians face is somehow contained here, and that the rest of us are insulated from it. But of course, while all the dilemmas may exist here, they are far from contained. We know the same dilemmas and more are faced all over Australia. And as I say, the starting point might be to recognise that the problem starts with us non-Aboriginal Australians. It begins, I think, with that act of recognition. Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases, the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice and our failure to imagine these things being done to us. With some noble exceptions, we failed to make the most basic human response and enter into their hearts and minds. We failed to ask, how would I feel if this were done to me? As a consequence, we failed to see that what we were doing degraded all of us. If we needed a reminder of this, we received it this year. The report on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody showed with devastating clarity that the past lives on in inequality, racism, and injustice. There is one thing today we cannot imagine. We cannot imagine that the descendants of those people whose genius and resilience maintained a culture here through 50,000 years or more, through cataclysmic changes to the climate and environment, and who then survived 2 centuries of dispossession and abuse, will be denied their place in the modern Australian nation. We cannot imagine that. We cannot imagine that we will fail. And with the spirit that is here today, I am confident that we won't. I am confident that we will succeed in this decade.